Hi everyone, welcome to the Spring 2016 Ed Club Gathering Workshop 12. Today's workshop will be presented by Amy Rasmussen and Shanna Carnes. Today, Amy and Shanna will talk to you about choice as the keystone in secondary English classes. Please remember to join in on the conversation by tweeting your comments or questions through the Ed Club Gathering Space 12. Over to you, Amy and Shanna.
Hello. We're excited to
Hi,
be
everyone. Here. Yes, we are.
You know, Shanna and I hang out quite a lot together and have conversations, but this is kind of a new and a little bit scary experience. But we're excited to share some of our ideas and the things that we do in our classrooms in terms of offering students choice. So I'm Amy Rasmussen. I am in Dallas, Texas, well, just north of Dallas, Texas. I teach at Louisville High School, and my partner in crime is Shanna. I'll let you introduce yourself.
And I'm Shanna Carnes, and I'm in Morgantown, West Virginia right now. Very excited, like Amy said, to be chatting with you all and just having another Google Hangout on a Saturday afternoon with Amy. We're excited to share all of our joy and passion about choice in the Readers Writers Workshop with you today.
So we wanted to let you in on, well, we decided to call this session Choice is the Keystone in Secondary English Classes. We believe passionately in allowing students to choose the books they read and the topics they write about, and often the genres that they write about. So we wanted to just give you a little bit of background first. Where we started was in 2013. We didn't know each other at all, but we both attended Penny Kittle's class at the University of New Hampshire Literacy Institute, and Shanna and I hit it off, and a couple other friends, Jackie and Emily and Erica, and I had already had this blog, Three Teachers Talk, that I was writing with a couple other friends, and we decided that we would take the learning that we experienced with Penny in her class, and since there were 4 of us in our class that just really bonded, that we were going to write about our journey applying some of the things we learned with Penny. And then, you know, over the past 2 years, it's kind of changed and taken a little bit of different shape in terms of what our blog is and what we write about. But it's all about our classrooms, how we do workshop, how we help kids make the choices that help them become lifelong readers and really effective and accomplished writers. So that's kind of where we started, and that's kind of where we are in terms of our blog, Three Teachers Talk.
So, like Amy said, we all met just very fortuitously at the University of New Hampshire Literacy Institutes, and we started writing together, talking together, doing Google Hangouts like you can see on our slideshow here, and we kind of started to call this the modern PLC. So we do this together quite regularly, and we are sometimes 2 teachers talk, sometimes 4 teachers talk, but no matter what, we just want to talk about our passion, which is teaching and advancing our students, and our love of reading and writing and sharing it with them. So we're just going to sort of model that today and just talk to each other and talk with you the way that we do all the time.
So we're going to well, I just wanted to add one thing, that this idea of talking and the benefit of being able to have other like-minded people that share your passion, share your philosophy of what you believe teaching can be and should be in your classrooms, but the support that Shanna and I are able to give each other, and hopefully support to other teachers who are venturing into this model of what does a workshop classroom look like, especially at the high school level. There, you know, we get all kinds of questions, and there's a lot of fear involved because people feel like they're all alone. And they're moving away from the traditional model of doing all literature where teachers make all the choices, and it can be a really scary place. Shanna and I have both been there, and we've come a long way in our journey into feeling confident in both readers and writers workshop classroom, and our story is a little bit different. I started teaching 10 years ago. I came to the profession late. I was a stay-at-home mom for my gaggle of children. Have 7. They're all grown up now, and so when I started teaching, I taught the same way that I learned when I was in high school, and the teachers made all the choices. We read traditional classic literature, we wrote analytical papers, and I thought that's how high school teaching was supposed to be in an English class. And it was I guess about 3 years later that I did a National Writing Project Summer Institute, and I learned about authentic writing practices, and that same summer was the first time that I heard Penny Kittle give a presentation, and so that's when I started making the move into being a workshop teacher. And I moved into writing workshop first. That was a lot easier for me than allowing choice in what students read. But I think, Shanna, you did the opposite, right?
Yeah, I was very lucky. I went to college at Miami University, and Tom Romano was one of my professors, and he's a great friend of so many amazing teacher writers like Penny Kittle and Tom Newkirk. So he implemented reading and writing workshop in our college class. So I had seen it modeled. I had a lot of the pieces of workshop in place when I first started teaching 8 years ago, but it wasn't until that summer when I went to Penny's class with Amy that I really figured out how they all went together and how amazing the results could be when I threw myself into it fully. So just meeting Amy and connecting with her and all of our other friends at UNH was what I needed to have the support to kind of make that jump. Amy calls it making the move into workshop a lot, but it's kind of like jumping off of a cliff too. It is a big shift because most of us have never experienced it. So we're trying something we've never seen or had modeled. So I love to listen to Amy share her journey, and I'm excited to hear her tell you kind of why she was ready to make this leap today.
So I was looking through my notebook of that class we took from Penny, and she called that class the art and craft of writing in our world. And I know it's kind of hard to see there, but she had us write what was at our teaching soul. And I don't know if you can see that, so I'll read it off. But what I wrote in my notebook was, I want to create lifelong readers where kids know books hold answers. I want to develop accomplished writers where kids know they have voices worth sharing and sharing them well. Empathy. My heart is turning toward global connections and service learning. I want students to leave me better as individuals than they were when they walked in my door. That's what I wrote in my notebook. You can see there what I turned into Penny, and you can see her little smiley face where she underlined a few things, and that was her feedback. I knew I needed to make some changes that summer, but like I said a minute ago, I started a little bit earlier, and you know, I think we've all experienced this, and we've heard so much about engagement and making things relative, and if we have kids where they're engaged in the learning, they're more likely to learn, and they'll follow along with us. Well, I taught a lot of compliant kids, and I thought that was engagement until I started giving students choice in what they wrote about, and then a little bit later what they read. You can see on the slide there a quote from my well, go back one just real quick. That little quote there is my student Joseph, who as a junior had never completed a book. And I teach juniors this year. For the past several years I have taught 11th grade, and every year I have students that have never finished a book. And since I've been giving choice, they all finish more than one book, and then there's such a feeling of accomplishment. I think it's a crying shame that kids can get to be juniors in high school and never finish a book on their own. And so moving to a workshop model where students have choice was as much about me and what I needed, and it felt like I needed to do for myself and my own career, and what I knew students needed to help them understand that they could grow as readers and writers, and then why they really needed to do that. So on the next slide, this is kind of a testimony of why we need to give students choice in terms of what they write about. I've always taught in a school that we have second language students, lots of them. We have students that live in poverty, primarily Title I schools, and this is one of the things one of my students last year wrote in her notebook in response to, I can't remember if it was a poem or a video or something that we watched, but I just had to make a list of what if. Again, this is a little bit hard to read, but she says, what if my dad didn't go to jail half my life? What if I wasn't raped by my mom's second husband? What if I never lost my grandma? What if my cousin never died? And it goes on. And here's a student who has had way too much to handle at a very young age. And as a teacher, as a writing teacher, I can help her figure some things out. And as a reading teacher, I can help her find books that can answer her questions. And that, to me, is the most important thing about giving students choice, helping them heal and helping them find themselves and grow into their identity before they leave us in just 2 short years. They walk out into the world beyond public high school. So that's just kind of how I wanted to set up what Shannon and I want to share with you today.
I love Amy's story about her students really becoming authentically engaged and how she wasn't sure that they were or weren't until she started to read that kind of writing, because it's so resonant with what happens in my classroom as well. And that's the kind of tear-jerking stuff that happens when you shift choice from the teacher to the student. But there's also all kinds of amazing advancement that happens in terms of their reading and writing skills. So Amy's going to talk about that now.
So a lot of the questions that we get asked on our blog or on our Facebook page have to do with research. Can you prove, do you have research to back up your pedagogy and why you do what you do? Well, you know what, there's tons of research. And we have some good friends who have done most of the work for us in terms of finding it. If you go and you look at the bibliographies of Penny Kittle's books, you'll find tons of academic research that she's grounded her work in. You can go read Donna Lynn Miller's book and Kelly Gallagher's books and all these great mentors that we love and love how they teach us how to be better teachers have done the research, and you know, all we have to do is look it up ourselves and then pay attention and we'll find it too. We have, of course, the next slide, Shannon, move that one. There we go. Slides of it where you can go and find academic articles and people who talk about the importance of choice and allowing them to choose what they read and what they write. There's just so much benefit and value there. But what I like in terms of research is the action research that comes out of my own classroom. And you can see on this next, move that, the next one, this is, I always have my students do reading evaluations, and this was a student last year, at the end of last year, how he surprised himself with how much growth he experienced as a reader. 10 books, and you can see some of them are pretty hefty in terms of the weight. He's got quite a variety, ending with that number 11, which was a Pulitzer Prize, or if it didn't win the Pulitzer, at least was on the nomination list. That was the end-of-year project we did where students all read a Pulitzer Prize book. So to me, that's the best kind of research, is what happens in my own classroom and seeing students where they can really see where they've grown as readers and writers. And then I love this quote this is an online article I read by Alfie Kohn. I believe it is time to call the bluff of every educator who claims to prize democratic principles. Anyone who truly values democracy ought to be thinking about preparing students to participate in a democratic culture or to transform a culture into a democracy, as the case may be. The only way this can happen, the only way children can acquire both the skills of decision making and the inclination to use them, is if we maximize their experiences with choice and negotiation. We have to teach them how to make the choices about the books they read and about the decisions they make as writers. We have to allow them to choose.
And I couldn't agree more with Amy. I love listening to her because I wrote down that title, Oxygen, by Andrew Miller. I can't wait to read it now. But that's just one of the things that I love to learn from her, a final project centered around award-winning literature. So it's one of the ways that I have started to reframe how I think about teaching reading. Instead of just teaching a novel that the canon thinks has literary merit, I look at something more contemporary now, like a Pulitzer winner, and think about how I can design reading instruction based on that. So that's what I wanted to kind of talk about for a little bit, was how I have shifted my reading instruction to mirror student choice rather than teacher choice. And so the biggest part of the learning for me in that regard involved finding new texts, like Oxygen that Amy just mentioned. And my friends are one of the biggest ways that I learn about new, amazing, challenging books. So here's Kevin English and Beth Shawm and I at the Allen Workshop this past fall at NCTE, just getting super excited about all these new books we unwrapped. And it's just such common sense to introduce that kind of literature into our classrooms and into our students' lives. Shouldn't schools be the place where students interact with interesting books, is what Kelly Gallagher asks. We can't depend on kids to just approach those things outside of class or after graduation. We should bring them into the classroom because it's more engaging and more enjoyable for everybody involved, I think, when we do. So love learning about new titles in that regard. So there's a couple ways that I think about how to set up reading instruction. And one of the ways that I think about it is that while students have the choice, all choice is no choice, says Don Graves. Students don't necessarily know how to choose great literature, or literature that is right for them, or literature that will help them grow, or even what we call literature at all. They might be reading something terrible, and we have no idea. So when we leave them on this path on the left, where they have too many choices, they don't tend to grow as readers. So we have to give them this guided choice, and part of that involves being a very informed, up-to-date teacher, knowing all about young adult literature, award winners, nonfiction, poetry, memoirs, things that are going to engage our students but also challenge them appropriately and relevantly. And that can be difficult to do alone, which is why this kind of modern PLC is so important. Find some friends who can help you find these resources, and it will become a really fun task. So there are 3 ways that I provide student choice in my classroom, and the first is independent reading. This is all student self-selected, but there are 3 kind of key factors, and one is a really diverse, eye-catching classroom library. Carol Jago says that the proximity to cool-looking books, no matter where it's at in your classroom or in your home, will increase the likelihood of reading for your students. So when you can put something beautiful on the shelves of your classroom, your students will be more inclined to grab those texts and start reading them. Time to read, both in school and the encouragement to do it outside of school, is the second important factor. And then for me, a lot of talk, a lot of conferencing, book talking, sharing during class to assess where students are at, encourage them to keep scaffolding up a ladder of text complexity, and advancing their reading skills, both individually and in group lessons, is the third key factor for me. So my classroom library at school looks an awful lot like my home library that you can see behind me. There's lots of text, and there's lots of decorations, and there's a lot of options. And I know Amy's looks like that too, if you can see it in her.
Right,
her
you can see a little bit of mine back there behind me. You can see some of my shelves over there. Shanna and I have both written on our blog about how we've gotten a lot of grants to help us choose books that help students. And I remember when I first started building a classroom library, I just thought I needed more books, you know? It's like, and I took whatever anybody could give me or whatever I could find at thrift stores. But then I really started realizing the importance of really curating a library and making sure that I not only had one of good books, but I've recently, with my grant money, I've bought 4 and 5 of the same copies, because if I book talk one and then it's gone and then it'll be gone for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and then students forget that they want to read that. And so that's one of the key things, is building a classroom library that you know the books in it, you know it really well, and you also, of course, have to get to know your students. You have to know what they like, what their interests are, what they do with their spare time, and that requires a lot of talking to students, and also allowing them to choose what they write about, because we can learn a lot about our students. I always start the year with a narrative. I'm kind of jumping into writer's workshop, and but that's such an important way to get to know our students. By allowing them choice in what they write about, let them write about their lives at the beginning of the year, and that will help us match them with the books that we can help them want to read. So I think that makes a big difference too.
And I love looking at Amy's bookshelf above her head. I think I can see 2 copies of All the Light We Cannot See up there, which is just reminiscent of what she said about curating a library. We've both talked about that a lot this year and made an effort to really find difficult texts. And for a text like that, I might introduce a text like that to a student like this by explaining to Logan, who goes by Bull, that All the Light We Cannot See is a book about war. And I know Bull. I've had him for 2 years in class now. He wrote a top 10 list recently called Books Every Country Boy Will Love. So he's not a kid who might have grown up with a lot of books. But he talked to me recently about why his reading life changed so much this year. And he said, reading calms me. It gives me something to do. And he lives on a farm. He has a 3-year-old little brother, and he shows me videos of showing his little brother how to till soil barefoot, which makes me very nervous. But he has this new habit of reading now, and he reads all these books about war. And I would totally recommend All the Light We Cannot See to him if it wasn't checked out right now. But this is a little sample of what he's read this year: The Monuments Men, The Auschwitz Escape, 2 books by Marcus Luttrell, Symphony for the City of the Dead by N.T. Anderson, which if you have not read that, you have to read that. And this is a student who last year when I had him, I could not really get him to love reading. And this year, he's a little older, he's found his niche, and he loves it. And he has skyrocketed in terms of his skill and his ability to make good choices for himself about which books he's going to like. And that's what led him to that last text, which is The Good Soldiers by David Finkel, which is a very difficult, complex text, but it was a book that he talked to me about for a long time, and he just loved that book.
Hey, I have a question. Is that is that book called Perfect? That 1/3 from the bottom in that picture? And is that a book of poetry? Is that a novel in verse?
Yeah, that's an Ellen Hopkins, and that was one where he just said, I want something quick, and I want something different. And when I was reading their reading ladders first quarter, many of the students said, I want to challenge myself. I need to read something different. And Bull said, I read too much war, and it's depressing. I want something fast. And there were several students who had read Crank, and so he grabbed an Ellen Hopkins book, which is like his little anomaly in that stack, which cracks me up.
That's cool.
Yeah.
That you made me think of 2 things. Well, now I can only remember one. But in terms of All the Light We Cannot See, I have a lot of people challenge me on, well, you teach AP, shouldn't kids be reading classics? How do you know they're going to ever choose complex books? Well, I do book clubs, and I know you're going to talk about that a little bit, But I had 4 kids choose All the Light We Cannot See, the most recent Pulitzer Prize, as book club, as their option to read. And I had one girl, she came in the classroom, she was about 3/4 of the way through, and she's just clutching this book to her chest. I love this book, I love this book, I love how it's written. And she just gushed. And of course, other students hear this, and that's what makes your heart flutter a little bit, where a student's chosen a book and has such a wonderful experience with it. You know that's a moment for that kid they're going to remember. And I listened to that book on audiobook, and I had a hard time keeping up because it switches time and it plays with your mind a little bit. But that was just a fantastic experience and a testimony that students will choose more difficult things when we talk about them, when we give them the option, and when they're ready for them.
And that's what's so important about the power of the student making the choice rather than you or I making the choice. And that is, one of the hallmarks here. I have a sample of one of my student, Julia, her writing from her self-evaluation. Her ability to make choices led to her engagement, which led to her growth. And she wrote, "The things we do in this class matter to me, and throughout the first semester, I've been exploring new ways of reading and writing. Last year I took AP, and I did not like it." She said, "I absolutely hated it. None of the stuff we did in that class mattered, so my work was awful. As a reader, I've grown tremendously this past semester. I like how you have book talks at the beginning of every class because that's how I determine what I want to read next. Your Carnes & Noble," that's what we call my classroom library, "is a distraction to my what to read list, but that's totally okay. I've never had any teacher who is so fond of their bookstore, and it is the most wonderful thing I've ever seen in an English class." And so, Julia, through all of those book talks and that passion about really complex texts, like Anthony Durr's book, is making choices on her own that are really challenging her and helping to move her authentically into more complex literature. So that second way that Amy already mentioned that we wanted to share was book clubs. So within book clubs, I always let students choose their groups, and then they can choose a title from within a genre that we're all going to look at together, or they choose a genre and they can have a group reading challenge where they pick different titles in that same genre, or we just sometimes have group reading instruction in the form of group conferences about a shared text. I love this book club here. This was a group of boys who picked Ishmael B's A Long Way Gone. I don't know if you can see the boy in the black striped shirt, but that was the first book that he read in, I think, 6 years. And he read it with his friends, and he chose to read it. And then they got up and they gave a group book talk on this book when they finished. And Mitchell said, "This book was like a drug. I literally couldn't stop reading it." And so when we let them make choices, the social capital and the social power of book love starts to come into play as well. And that boy would not have been able to finish that book, I don't think, without the help of his friends and the excitement and the drug-like contagion of that student's fascination with that book. So I think book clubs for me were a big revelation, something that's much less structured than literature circles, just far more choice in process, text, genre, and everything else. So
it was when I made my move into the choice reading part, I didn't have a classroom library yet, but I did move to book clubs, and that's where the choice came in for me first. Is I was already doing writer's workshop, and so I started introducing choice through book clubs where I would choose 5 or 6 titles, and then students could choose from those books. And I always tried to, and I still do, I have at least one classic and then several other contemporary books that are award winners that they can choose from. So that's a good first step for a lot of people who are afraid to let go of control completely.
Yeah, and I still haven't quite let go of whole class novels. I did a little experiment last year where I didn't teach any whole class novels, but I just felt like there was something missing, so we've done a couple this year. And so one of the things I've tried to utilize is technology in helping to allow students to choose what novel we study together. This is a picture of some of my students. We read the graphic novel Watchmen, which is available free online. So we studied that together, but that was a student-chosen text. When I choose the text, I try to keep it short. We read tons of poems, lots of articles, lots of short stories, and that's a great way to teach those skills that we need to teach in terms of reading instruction, but with something that's short and sweet and to the point. When I do a whole novel, instead of focusing on what is the book about, I think of a theme that novel might fit into. So for Watchmen, our theme was power. Or we try to engage students based on a response to the literature, which is something that Amy and I have been talking a lot about, is how to get our students to make connections, text-to-self connections and text-to-world connections. And then the last way to provide choice is just choice in process. Instead of saying everybody has to be on page 40 by day 2, we just tell the students when we'd like to have a conversation about a certain chunk of the novel, and they can kind of get there on their own. I'm going to end with a little quote from A.J. Fickrey in The Storied Life, or Gabrielle Zevin in The Storied Life of A.J. Fickrey. She is a character who asks about the book Moby Dick, and this is a bookseller who's talking to a book editor. "I hate it," she says, "and I don't say that about many things. Teachers assign it, and parents are happy because their kids are reading something of quality. But it's forcing kids to read books like that make them think they hate reading." And I think forcing kids is the word that makes kids think they hate reading. And they really don't. We just have to show them all the ways that they can find a love of reading once again.
That's so great. And you know, what's coming is talking about conferring with kids. And we get a lot of questions about how do you confer with kids? How do you do it when you've got a classroom of 30 students? How do you find the time? And, you know, I'm not sure there is any definitive answer. I think it's all we've got moving targets in workshop classrooms, and we have to set up certain rituals and routines that are non-negotiable, and conferring has to be one of them. That's the only way that I have found that either reader's workshop, allowing choice, independent reading works, is to confer with kids a lot, and also writing workshop. We have to be talking to our students a lot about what they're reading. Donald Murray, if you'll move to the next slide, Shanna. I love this quote. I've been reading and rereading his book, Learning Through. I think it's Learning Through Teaching, not by teaching, but at least 85% of the teaching or learning takes place in the writing conference, not in the writing workshop or classroom. And I think we could substitute reading in there too. It's whoever's doing the talking is the one who is really doing the learning in terms of what are you reading? Tell me about that in terms of what are you writing, or what are you hoping to say in this piece of writing. And so we have to allow time to confer. And I have to put it into my lesson plans and write it in there. Here's my time. My students read at the beginning of class at least 10 minutes, sometimes 15. One day this week they read 20. And while they're reading, I am trying to make myself talk to as many kids as I can. And I know that sounds bad, make myself, but it's so easy to think, oh, I need to get this done. I have these emails to answer. I need to make sure I check my attendance. I get called on the carpet every day for second period attendance. I get an email, you have not done your attendance yet. And it's because I'm trying to talk to students at the beginning of the period, and then I forget, and then I get in trouble. But we have to make sure we do that. And what's hard for me is the students that want to talk for a long period of time. And then I can't get to enough of them during that. And so I do a lot of informal conferences, and then I keep records of my formal conferences. And I think that's how I've made it work for me, is to do both. So if you can, there we go. What I'm trying to do in formal conferences is this little approach where I ask them a question, I get students talking, and then I'm listening and I'm finding out, well, what do they really need from me? So I'm doing some kind of an assessment, and then I try to repeat it back to them and confirm, is this really what I'm hearing? Is this really what you need? And then I try to validate them. Whatever they've written, whether it's a sentence, a paragraph, whatever they've read, even if it's only a few pages, then students need validation. They need to know whatever they're doing, that we recognize their effort, even if it isn't what we think is great. And then include some kind of little instruction. And then I'm trying this close where I give the student the charge to, okay, how are you going to take what we just talked about and go and apply that into your reading or your writing? And making the student be the one that's responsible for the follow-up instead of me. And I wish it was working better, but it's something that I really want to keep working at, because I think that's important, especially working with teenagers, is giving them the choice to apply what we discussed in that conference or not. Now, of course, there's some students where need a little bit more guidance and, no, this is what you need to do. I have a few of those where I can't allow them too much choice when it comes to some things in their writing, because they're so far they need a lot more help than other students do. So anyway, that's kind of the approach that I've been taking lately, that I'm finding some success with in terms of my formal conferences. Informal conferences can look like any of these 6 things, where I try to start before the bell. I have a few kids that will come in before the bell rings, so I try and do a little informal conference with them. Sometimes I go to them and do it in groups, in little kneeling by their tables, and then I'll do a little group conference, bundle them up. That's what I call those. Make it voluntary. If I know that a student's struggling, or several of them, and then I may say, okay, anybody who's struggling with thesis statements, let's meet over at the couch, and also group them through feedback in their writing. That works really well. I think I learned that from Penny, to put a little code on their papers. Everybody's struggling with transitions. You've got a little TR down at the bottom of your paper. Now everybody who has that little code, come over and let's work through that. And then silent conferences. I do a lot of things on sticky notes, and they turn them in to me, and then I write something and I give them back. So there's lots of ways we can talk to our students, and it doesn't have to be this formal thing where we're having to fill out a form. I do think that the formal conferences are important, and that's where the most instruction can happen, but the informal conferences are just as important. We only have a few minutes, so we need to rush through this last part, Shanna.
Yeah, and I have to agree with what Amy said about formal versus informal conferences. So many of my formal conferences are writing conferences, which is what I'm going to talk about now, but many of my reading conferences are very informal, at the bookshelf, at the door, wherever you can fit them in. So what's important is just talking to your students as much as you can. So when we think about writing instruction in terms of choice, I just read Writing with Mentors by Rebecca Odell and Allison Marchetti, fantastic text, and I loved how they succinctly summed up they either need choice in topic, choice in genre, or choice in writing process. I try to allow for choice in 2 out of 3 whenever I'm designing writing instruction. I think for me, the other important factor in terms of choice is that it's all about the teacher's choice. We can choose which genres we teach, and that was a big shift for both Amy and I in terms of writing instruction after we met. Instead of teaching a persuasive essay, we thought, where do we find persuasive writing in the real world, and how can we get our students doing that kind of writing? Mm-hmm. And so we just, in West Virginia, finished a whole unit on political rhetoric and studying how people persuade us, how these politicians, I won't say any names, are getting so far. And Amy just did this fantastic unit on persuasion and argument writing through spoken word poetry. And so the writing instruction shifted in our classrooms greatly and became much more authentic, and all just through modeling, watching lots of examples and reading lots of examples of the kinds of things we want our students to write, and then allowing them choice in their topic. It's so easy to help them grow when we approach something like that, and it's more enjoyable for both Amy and myself. So this is Carlene, a student who loves reading, loves writing. She's a big Harry Potter fan, and she said the freedom to choose helped her writing immensely because she cared about the topic and enjoyed writing about it. I realize I'm eventually going to write about things I don't care about, and I probably won't enjoy doing it, but I have been looking at writing differently now. I don't see it as a chore. It's something I do on a weekly basis, and it's become a habit. I no longer see it in a negative way, and that has helped me grow as a writer. I think we cannot shortchange enjoyment in terms of engagement. If kids don't love what they're doing, they're probably not going to do it enough to get better at it. I heard Pam Allen at NCTE say, it is mandatory to get students to fall in love with reading and writing. That has to be a standard, and I have to agree with her. So I think personal connections to what we're reading and writing about in our classes are what's essential in terms of helping students get to that level of fluency. And so the writer's notebook for both Amy and I is an essential and non-negotiable. It acts like a playground. It's a workshop, and it's a repository of all of the practice writing that we do. That's a great one from Tom Romano. And we cannot let our students hold them to a certain genre that we were taught in high school, the 5-paragraph you-know-what, as we like to call it. And that's what I got really good at writing, but I never knew how to write really well until I wrote for myself. And so that's what I'm trying to get my students to do. We had a question about the academic writing and how that was a little bit more difficult to teach compared to narrative writing because narrative is so personal. And I would say that just comes back to making the teacher's choice in terms of what genre to teach in those 3 categories, informative and argumentative writing. We are doing a comedy unit in my classroom right now. We're looking at satires and stand-up routines, and we're looking at all of the different skills that go into that kind of writing. And that has become so much more engaging than just an informative essay or a how-to piece of writing. And I think when we open our minds as teachers to the kinds of writing we want our students to do, that's where we can offer them the opportunity to grow much more authentically in terms of academic and nonfiction writing.
One thing I thought of as you were talking about that is, you remember how Penny had us, we looked at narrative, and then she projected on the board, and then she had us take that narrative and use it as an introduction, and how you take narrative writing and then turn it into informative or persuasive argumentation or whatever. And that's what I've done a lot with my students since I learned that from her. And that's where we get buy-in for their academic type of writing, where they've already written something that's personal, they care about. Matter of fact, my student teacher and I just recently, he had him do a life map. Here we are the third 9 weeks, and we just did that because I wanted him to have that experience. And then they chose topics out of their life map, and they had to write questions that they can turn into thesis statements for informative kind of writing. And that's what's worked for me, to have students have the buy-in where they're writing about something that is personal to them, even if it isn't, a story of their lives, but it's about the same topics.
Yeah, I agree. And the last thing I wanted to say about writing instruction is it all becomes so much more powerful when you write beside your students. And I know Amy and I have had a lot of success figuring out what's a good assignment and what's a bad one when we struggle to write it with our kids. And so it looks like we're pretty close to out of time. So we wanted to thank everyone so much for joining us today and invite you to join our conversation at 3 Teachers Talk or with us on Twitter. We'd love to talk more with everyone about choice. And Amy has a fantastic little note from one of her students here.
Isn't that funny? That was on my board at the end of close to the end of last year. It's like we need a little work here because we're still missing something in that little note that that student left me. But we thought that would be a fun thing to end with because here we are, we're all close to the end of this year, but we have lots of time that we can still implement choice in our classrooms. We can introduce books to kids maybe a different way, or new books to kids. We can allow them choice in what they are reading. This last 9 weeks of school, I'm trying something new starting on Monday in terms of writing. I asked my students, what can we do to get more students reading, and they came up with their own, they want to create their own reading challenge. So that's what we're doing in class on Monday, and the more I talk about books, the more students talk about books, the more they read, and the same thing with writing. We just talk about it all the time, and we do it every day. Read, write, confer, read, write, confer, over and over and over again. Thanks, everybody, for joining us, and we love and appreciate you, appreciate your reading our blog, and invite you all to join the conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Amy and Shanna, for such an informative session about the importance of choice in the classroom. So many great ideas and resources. I've added some new books to my reading list. I hope everyone enjoyed this as much as I did. Please continue to tweet any questions or comments you have about the session to the Ed Collab Gathering, space 12. And before we sign off, I'd love to share the upcoming sessions with you and hope that some of you can continue to stick around to hear more great professional developments. So in the next session, there will be workshop 14. Stacy, Deb, Donna, and Betsy will be informing us how to maximize independent writing time by creating conferring toolkits. In workshop 15, Martha and Gwen will be giving us resources to create great reading and writing methods for visual learners. In workshop 16, Brittany, Holly, and Lynn will be bridging school and home fun with family-friendly resources. And in workshop 17, Jen and Taylor will be teaching us about conscious coaching. Again, please sign in to some of these, and following that will be the ending session. Thank you so much.